Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning to some, good evening to others. Welcome to this webinar on SIDA's application of a human rights-based approach. The webinar today will present and discuss SIDA's approach and experience with a human rights-based approach to development cooperation, which it has been implemented since 2003. The implementation followed the UN Common Understanding on a human rights-based approach to development cooperation and some other good international practices. But the implementation has also been very much learning by doing, because SIDA was one of the pioneers in this respect. A recent evaluation of the approach shows that the application of a human rights-based approach has led to a number of important results, but also highlights some learning points which will be discussed also today. Promised to become a very interesting webinar with many participants from many different parts of the world. And as always, we want to organize this webinar in an interactive manner. So if you have any questions for the speakers today, you can send them to us via chat box, and we will feed them into the discussion which will follow the presentation. The webinar today is a joint organization of the Belgian Supporting Research Group on a Human Rights-Based Approach to Development, on which Geoffrey from the University of Liège will say more words in a minute, and a newly established working on human rights and sustainable development, which was formed in the context of the World Bank Global Forum on Law, Justice and Development, and that was launched at the end of last year. The working group will explore the legal, policy and operational links between rights and sustainable development, with a focus specifically on the Sustainable Development Goals and SDG 16 in particular. The working group is coordinated by a number of organizations and people, including the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs, the World Bank Human Rights, Inclusion and Empowerment Umbrella Program, the World Bank Legal Vice Presidency, and the Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies of the University of Leuven, of which I'm the Deputy Director. Through a series of activities, such as research reports, workshops, and webinars as we have today, we aim to create and share knowledge on a series of topics related to human rights and sustainable development, including topics related to a human rights-based approach to development cooperation. The working group aims to create a forum for exchange of best practices, ideas, and tools dedicated to the operationalization and implementation of a human rights-based approach to development cooperation. And the webinar of today is then also, of course, extremely topical and timely to discuss some of these tools and approaches and learn from one of the pioneers in the field. So do not forget, if you want to engage with us in the webinar, feel free to ask questions through our chat box, and then we can also feed them into the discussion. Now it's my pleasure to hand over to my colleague and moderator, Geoffrey Matagne of the University of Liège. Geoffrey, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Welcome to everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to act as a moderator for this discussion and this webinar. With colleagues from the KU Leuven and Université Saint-Louis Brussels, we are part of a research consortium called the Policy Supporting Group, a research group on human rights-based approach to development. Our main goal is to help and support the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Belgium and its general direction for development cooperation to actually mainstream a human rights-based approach to development. So in that context, it's very, very interesting for us to first have read and now to have the opportunity to listen to the presentation on that SIDA survey, which is a very impressive, comprehensive effort to actually evaluate the application of and the effects of a human rights-based approach to development, with a very interesting time frame of more than 10 years, and SIDA being one of the pioneers among the bilateral donors for the implementation of human rights-based approach to development, this evaluation exercise is very, very interesting for all of us, of course. So not to lose too much time for this interesting discussion and presentation, I will just briefly give a few elements of information for the procedures. First of all, this webinar will be recorded and it will be put on the general project website that Axel Marx mentioned before. If you have any questions for the presenters, please do not hesitate to use the section questions in the configuration panel that should be on the right of your screen. And of course, this study is available online, and the web link will be communicated through probably the chat box. So it's now my pleasure to give the floor to Birgitta Weibahr, which is a lead policy specialist on democracy and human rights at SIDA, and to Charlotte Ståhl, who is a senior program manager and specialist at SIDA as well.
So, thank you very much, Geoffrey, and good afternoon and good morning, everybody. My name is Birgitta Weibahr. I'm SIDA's lead policy specialist on democracy and human rights, and I'm going to walk you through this presentation together with Charlotte Ståhl, senior program manager and specialist on human rights and democracy. And Charlotte has also previously been seconded to the EU DG for International Partnerships, former DevCo. We're delighted, of course, to get this opportunity to present SIDA's application of a human rights-based approach, the approach and results and lessons learned to the working group on human rights and sustainable development. As Axel said, SIDA's applied a human rights-based approach to development cooperation at least since 2003, since it was formally established in Swedish policy. And there's a reason that this coincided with the establishment on the UN Common Understanding on a human rights-based approach, since Sweden and SIDA were heavily involved in this process. So next slide, please. Thank you. So what is a human rights-based approach in Swedish development cooperation? It's firstly one of Sweden's 5 what we call perspectives. From the beginning, Hrba was intertwined with the perspectives of people living in poverty. These were kind of the first integration issues that were established. And since then, the perspectives of gender equality, environment and climate, and conflict sensitivity have been added. And we're governed on application of these perspectives. It's compulsory to integrate them into Swedish development cooperation. And as most of you know, Hrba is an approach which combines development and human rights agendas and frameworks. It's about promotion and protection, fulfillment of human rights in practice. And this is why it's such an important feature of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. We will come back to this in a while. Hrba is a normative, rather common sense approach used to improve the quality of analysis, programming, and dialogue with partners and stakeholders. It's about why and what we do. It's about goal and result, that development cooperation should contribute to fulfillment of human rights. And it's about how we work, the process. HRBA is a working methodology where you integrate human rights into analysis, plans, and programs in all sectors and all modalities, and in each step of the program cycle. So the government of Sweden defines HRBA in terms of democracy, human rights, and including gender equality, and application of the 4 principles: non-discrimination, equality, participation, transparency and openness, and accountability. Sweden has chosen to emphasize these human rights principles, which can be seen as practically applicable working principles. And the approach is about empowerment of rights holders and capacity development of duty bearers, but also about pushing and navigating the political agenda where there is no political will, and not just about developing capacity. So next slide, please. And I hand over to Charlotte.
Yes, please. So hello, good afternoon. My name is Charlotte Ståhl, as Birgitta has already presented. So then, what have we done in practice? Because as Birgitta explained, we have introduced it as a working methodology. So we have the 4 working principles, but to make it even more workable, we have organized it, the working principles, into what we call it planet. So key components of the human rights-based approach. So we have developed a methodological material, the so-called toolbox, for the application of the HRBA for SIDA staff, but of course also available for partners and others. It's available on our external website. We are now reviewing it, also as a consequence of the evaluation, as we will explain a little bit later on. And I think that we will be able to see it here as well, a link to our method support on our external website will be shared in the chat box. So we have organized the working principles according to planet, because I think we think that there was a convenient abbreviation. So we first have the P as participation, and then we have developed some guiding questions in relation to the working principles, or to these key components. So we have participation, we have the link to the human rights systems. So more concretely, how we in our program and planning our programs make sure that we make use of what comes out of the human rights system, both the international and regional ones, of course. So we make use of the recommendations and the information provided there. So that's the L, and then we have the accountability. So who are the duty bearers, and so on. I will not read it out for you, and you will of course be able to see it afterwards as well. So these are the first 3 ones, and of course it's more like a checklist and presented as a framework. So it should be easier for colleagues and partners to make use of, both in planning contributions, but also to assess and follow up contributions and programs. And it can also, of course, be used in dialogue with partners. And they are supposed, or these questions and key components are supposed to be able to be used in all countries and all thematic areas. So the last three ones, if you could please change slide. Do we see them now? So non-discrimination. So who are the right holders? Have they been taken into account in designing the contribution? Have the efforts been made to include the most marginalized, and so on? And then empowerment, and then finally transparency. We will come back later in the presentation on planet and how we make use of it, but even more so how we will make use of it in the future. So if we could please change slide. So in the SIDA toolbox, as I said, now available also on our external website, we have different briefs, thematic briefs mainly, and you can see here what they include: education and skills development, environment and climate, democratic governance, health, and so forth. And these are also constructed in relation to the planet principles, or the planet working principles. And these will also be now revised in this revision exercise of the whole toolbox. And several other briefs will be developed as well. So these are the thematic ones, and then we have a specific on the rights of the child as well. We have briefs on human rights of persons living with disabilities, and also the human rights of LGBTIQ+ persons, both per country and region. But in the review and the follow-up and the evaluation, we've seen that those briefs were less used. And I think what we will now do instead, that we will develop more clarification concerning non-discrimination and equality in relation to specific discriminated against groups. We also have a link to this toolbox in our contribution management system at SIDA, and we also have specific questions in the contribution management system, though less so on the follow-up in the system, and that has been also identified as a weakness by this evaluation that we will come back to later on. Next slide, please. So then we have, of course, what we will also do is that, because as was said earlier on, we have been working and supposed to work as well, one should say as well, from a human rights base since 2003. And then since then, of course, we have the development of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. So in the revision as well, we will of the methodological material, we will further introduce the SDGs and also the strong link with the SDGs in relation to human rights, because of course we at SIDA, we make use of the SDGs, linking the SDGs to human rights, because of course we don't only have SDG 16, promote peaceful and inclusive society, being a specific human rights target, but of course we have all the 17 SDGs relating to human rights, and this has been very well formulated by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and also together with the Danish Institute for Human Rights, who have developed excellent tools in this regard, showing that 90% of the targets in the SDGs are linked to provisions of international human rights instruments. So this will be further then added to our material as well. But already now, of course, we make this link. And the strength with this is that, first of all, our development programs will be more sustainable and, of course, have more sustainable results if we also can link it to the specific human rights commitments made in country. And it also facilitates dialogue with partners, having it introduced also in the 2013 agenda. So over to you, Birgitta.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Yes, the application of a human rights-based approach also takes place at country and regional and even global level. SIDA has another toolbox, which we call the Poverty Toolbox. It's developed for multidimensional poverty analysis, mainly at country level, but it can be used, as I said, also at regional and global level. And this is the structure of it that you see here. And a human rights-based approach is an integrated part of the multidimensional poverty analysis framework, MDPA framework. It's part of all the dimensions of poverty of the MDPA, which is whether it's opportunities and choice, human security, access to resources, or power and voice. And the rationale behind it is that poverty is about lack of fulfillment of human rights. The human rights-based approach is also part of the political and institutional context analysis part in this framework. And SIDA also has a guide on power analysis when there is a need for digging deeper in this respect. The MDPA should inform SIDA's operationalization of strategies, what we call strategies. They govern the direction, goals, and thematic areas, etc., of Sweden's development cooperation at country and regional and global level. And further down the road, MDPA should also inform contributions to programs and partners, of course. So next slide, please. What we have not mentioned is that SIDA also promotes and support Hrba in other ways by providing seconded expert staff to the EU DG for international partnerships, for instance. A colleague is there now, and Charlotte was there a couple of years ago, and to the World Bank through the Human Rights and Development Trust Fund. And as I said, and Charlotte said, through normative dialogue also with various important partners. And SIDA, as I said, has applied a human rights-based approach for years. We've been contacted on numerous occasions by various actors on how we apply the approach and what lessons we've learned and what this has resulted in. And in 2019, we finally decided to embark on a more systematic and strategic evaluation of our application and the effects of the approach. And the evaluation is ready and available on SIDA's website in a database. The purpose of the evaluation was to systematize knowledge and learning and to generate lessons on what has worked well, less well, and why. We looked at relevance, effectiveness, and the effects, both impacts and results, and we based it on 4 country cases: Colombia, Albania, Cambodia, and Kenya. And we will present the key conclusions and the recommendations, but it's important also to remember that we are in the middle of working out our management response to this right now, and that means that we may not endorse all recommendations, of course. And next slide, please. Here you see the key conclusions. One group of conclusions are about application of the approach. The evaluators say that the approach is embedded in Swedish development cooperation. It's a point of departure. But there's a big difference in how HRBA is applied, depending on the individual, what part of the organization we're talking about, depending on the contribution or program and context. At SIDA and our embassies and among cooperation partners, there is often no clear distinction between applying a human rights-based approach as a method and more generally putting the advancement of human rights at the center of your work. The application of the human rights-based approach has been the basis for principled long-term support to actors who share the goal of promoting development towards a more open, basically, rather than authoritarian society. And they also say that it's the human rights-based approach in aggregate. Principles focus on addressing power imbalances between rights holders and duty bearers and seeking to advance human rights that together have contributed to results. But the evaluators also say that SIDA and our partners do not fully comprehend and systematically apply a human rights-based approach, meaning all its components. They also say that to enable application of the approach, you need political skills, knowledge of context, ability to adapt to social and political conditions, and you need to invest in long-term relationships with partners and stakeholders. Regarding effects, the evaluators say that assessing the effects of the approach is linked to program results. They also say it's impossible to isolate the impact of a human rights-based approach from other changes in the context. You can't really measure impact. Nevertheless, it was reported that application of the approach has considered to have contributed to improved access to basic services, human rights protection, voice and agency, and also SIDA-funded interventions were seen to help prevent human rights violations. More concretely, a number of results were reported more on program level. Among rights holders, they mentioned changes in awareness of human rights, improved capacities and skills in leveraging or advancing the human rights-based approach principles, increased access to and participation in decision-making processes, and enhanced ability to organize and work collectively. Also then improved access to basic services, rights protection, and improved agency empowerment. And among rights holder organizations, they reported changes in internal governance structures and management capacity, in membership and representation, and improved capacities and skills in leveraging or advancing human rights-based approach principles and legal norms. Finally, then, among duty bearers, the hard nut to crack, they reported changes in mindsets and attitudes, capacities, skills, and behavior. Also institutional, legal, and policy change, as well as changed practices. One effect was also that the approach strengthened and clarified Sweden's commitment to promoting and protecting human rights through development cooperation. A pretty logical result, perhaps. Finally, there is a conclusion on the lack of systematic collection, documentation, and application of lessons learned. And this is an issue that obviously partly goes beyond our application of a human rights-based approach. It has to do with, being an organization that systematically works with learning. So over to you, Charlotte, and next slide, please.
So the consultants came up with many recommendations, of course, that we are now, as Birgitta said, processing internally at SIDA to come up with a management response. But the recommendations are divided in 4 clusters. So the first cluster of recommendations is about prioritizing HRBA in the organization and focusing on planet, as we explained before. That means that the comprehension of HRBA needs to be strengthened, and that we should invest in communicating and ensuring the use of HRBA with a focus on the Planet 6 components, and use it as the overarching framework. Within that cluster as well, we have a recommendation to regularly update the HRBA methodological materials and tools, as well as a multidimensional poverty analysis tool, as Birgitta presented before, to ensure the links to HRBA, so to integrate it into in the MDPA tool more thoroughly. And then a clearer focus on adjusting the application of an HRBA to the local political economy context, and adaptive, and make sure that we have adaptive ways of working. So that was the first cluster of recommendations. The second cluster of recommendations is about adapting to context, partners, and how SIDA manage contributions. So the evaluators recommended SIDA to engage staff in discussions across the organization on how to integrate a human rights-based approach at different levels, institutional, strategy, and contribution and program level, and use as point of departure the local context. And then review SIDA's contribution management system to ensure that HRBA is included in all parts of the program cycle. And at country level, so country embassy level, this means communication on how to apply human rights-based approach in contributions and in programs. So in the beginning of a program, and then revisit on a semi-annual basis with a focus on changes in the context that need to be considered. The evaluators also proposed the revision of SIDA's digital contribution management system to ensure that HRBA is included in all parts of the program cycle, not just to the partial phase, which is now the case, and also to be able to document and include learning. So next slide, please. So then in the third cluster, it's about documentation of experiences and lessons learned. So it includes reviewing tools and indicators for follow-up and evaluation of a human rights-based approach, and establishment of a SIDA platform for systematic generation of knowledge and evidence related to the application of a human rights-based approach. The evaluators also emphasize the importance of adopting to the political economy context and therefore best fit and not just best practice. They also proposed new types of communication materials. So that was the third cluster. So the fourth and final cluster of recommendations is about the need to further develop and the capacity to apply a human rights-based approach. So to continue to develop different types of trainings and capacity strengthening actions on application of a human rights-based approach for SIDA, Swedish embassies, but also to cooperation partners. And then there are a number of different proposals. One is about giving the national program officers at the embassies a more strategic role in training of sent out staff in contextual knowledge related to human rights and democracy, and how a human rights approach can be applied in that specific context. So that was our last slide of this presentation, and we look forward to be able to answer any questions and look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for this very clear and interesting presentation of SIDA survey. We already have received several questions, so don't hesitate to ask your questions in the question box on the right of your screen. Some questions are directly dedicated to SIDA, but they are concerning more internal matters. So for those people asking those questions as how to apply to SIDA, etc., the presenters will receive the questions later on. What I'm going to try to do is to group the questions by themes or topics, maybe to take 2 or 3 questions and then to ask them to the presenters. We will have time for a few rounds of questions, so please don't hesitate to share your thoughts and questions. First of all, you talked about, well, the lessons learned, the recommendations, and you mentioned that, of course, SIDA is working on the management response. Maybe we would like to know at that stage what would be more challenging, what would be more relevant among those recommendations that you have already mentioned. What are the key challenges in terms of acting upon those recommendations? A second question is the following. There are several approaches to development cooperation, several tools, power analysis, context analysis. You talked about the MDPA. It's sometimes difficult to actually coordinate all those approaches, and sometimes, given the difficulty to work with too many toolboxes or checklists or approaches at the same time, the human rights-based approach is put on the side. What do you think about that? What about those coordination challenges for SIDA? What lessons learned from this survey? Maybe a last question for this first round of questions. One key challenge for implementing a human rights-based approach to development and actually mainstreaming it across all the programs of one bilateral cooperation is the training of staff at all levels. Can you share some insights from your experience about how you organize trainings, what lessons learned, you came up with this survey on the format of trainings, etc. Also, of course, the materials for the trainings, supporting materials. So 3 questions for this first round.
Thank you, Geoffrey. I'll start with your first one. Yes, like we said, we haven't worked out the management response yet, and as always with evaluations, they also create very high expectations on massive change, and then we know that usually there's very little resources extra resources allocated to carry out all these recommendations. But we have actually, what we have started doing, and which is also a main track, we will revise our toolbox, and we have done a very broad survey with colleagues on whether the one that we have is being used and how it's being used, and we will have that as the point of departure when we revise the methodological support toolbox that we have, and try to link as many of the recommendations as possible to this revised toolbox. But that's just the first step. But we believe that it's extremely important to have a good and user-friendly toolbox, which people actually, say and they use and actually use. But of course, then, if I may jump then to your third question, training, because I mean that's the point of departure, and then people need to be trained. In using, you need to link the training to the toolbox, and the training we have carried out the last couple of years, or 3 years, is basically only at introductory level, and now we want to change that, and we hope to develop e-training and e-course on introductory HRBA, or an introduction to HRBA, to be able to focus our training, which we do carry out twice a year, on digging a bit deeper, for more advanced training. We want to develop a training method that's going to be part of revising the methodological material, a training module that we can use both at embassy level and adjust to different contexts, and at SIDA Stockholm level and adjust to various strategies, be it global or regional level strategies. Regarding the tools, yes, I mean there are coordination challenges, and there can be competition among the tools and what we call perspectives. It's true, and it's an issue that comes up over and over again. We are planning to work together, the colleagues who kind of own the different strategies and the methodological work linked to these strategies, to work on how we can show our colleagues how you coordinate and integrate these perspectives. It has been done through this MDPA. I mean, that is now updated, and it much better shows how all our so-called perspectives are integrated. But we also need to show our colleagues how they can integrate these integration issues also at program level, so that they don't you know, so that we don't fall into the so that basically, I mean, there's a risk of fatigue, right? That people back off because there are too many integration issues, and we don't want to risk that. So we will work on that. Charlotte, would you like to?
Yes, thank you. And yes, of course, there are coordination challenges, and that was something that we experienced when I was seconded to the EU as well. And this fatigue concern when it comes to mainstreaming of all different perspectives. But I think what we need to do, even if we will not maybe be able to do it now, we need to have it integrated in our contribution management systems more thoroughly. So it actually comes out as questions, not only in the beginning of when we plan or we first start the appraisal of a new contribution, but it also comes up in the follow-up and the monitoring and so on. And sell it to, it sounds strange maybe, but sell it to colleagues as the working methodology that actually facilitates the integration of all perspectives. And that's why we have done this planet checklist, just to illustrate that this is quite common sense. You know, it's the smart and sustainable way of doing things, and it shouldn't be too complicated. What we've seen, maybe during the last 10 years, that we need to maybe do more trainings on specific human rights. So we take away this feeling that the human rights system is so complicated and it's so legalistic, and that you do not understand what's in the information provided by, for example, say the Committee on the Rights of the Child or special rapporteurs and so on. So I think we need to work on that, and I think we should do that together with concerned UN agencies, but also within the EU, for example, that we can talk more on the usefulness of all the information coming out from the human rights system, both national and international and regional, and to make use of that in our program.
I think what Charlotte said, that's also a usefulness that with Planet. I mean, that we emphasize the L in Planet, that we want to promote the L much more than we do today, and tell our colleagues that the human rights systems are gold mines, you know, with when it comes to information and baselines and possibility to follow up, get data on processes and how you can follow up on issues, human rights issues, and so on.
And linking it to the SDGs, of course, to make it even more sustainable and strong.
Well, thank you. I have a few more questions. The first one would be, how does SIDA approach the notions of collective rights and rights of nature within a human rights-based approach? That would be a first question. Then another question is about gender. How does gender fit in the general human rights-based approach of SIDA? Is there a separate gender analysis tool or approach, or is it under the general non-discrimination principle automatically? What is specific to gender? Because many comments and questions were actually saying that SIDA has a very strong commitment to gender equality. And then maybe a question on humanitarian issues. What specific challenges does SIDA observe within the field of humanitarian issues as far as its human rights-based approach is concerned? So 3 questions. Collective and natural rights, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So when it comes to collective rights, and you said rights of nature?
Yep.
Or what? Yeah, right. No, I mean, a human rights-based approach is to us, it's a framework. It's a normative methodology that you can apply on any program, on any issue that you work with, or any context. So if you work with programs that concern collective rights, you can apply it. And I mean, it's more, it's an approach that with questions and components that you can use in analyzing and moving forward, also regarding collective rights. And since it includes all human rights, it also includes collective rights, such as rights of indigenous peoples, for instance, of course. We have made an effort to integrate and work more closely with colleagues working with environment issues and human rights defenders engaged in environment and natural resource extraction, and so on. And what we've seen is that a human rights-based approach is, I mean, it's applicable in all situations and regarding all programs and on all rights. Yes, gender equality. Yes, we do have. I mean, that's, since we're governed on gender equality separately as a thematic area and also as a perspective, as an integration issue, mainstreaming issue, there is a separate toolbox for gender equality and tools to help colleagues working on mainstreaming gender equality. But that doesn't mean that there is a huge overlap, of course, you know, and when you look at how people analyze and move forward in appraising programs, for instance, program support, they use both and integrate both perspectives. When you apply the principle of non-discrimination, it's very often about men and women, boys and girls. So sure, there's an overlap, but again, since we're governed on the two, we also have developed separate toolboxes. As I said before, we will make an effort in the near future to explain the links between these different perspectives. That is definitely needed. Humanitarian issues. Actually, well, we all know that human rights apply in humanitarian contexts. When I worked with refugees in the 90s, it was said that human rights, that's peacetime, and international humanitarian law, that's wartime, and which is not the case, of course. But the way we are governed, a human rights-based approach actually applies to development cooperation, not to humanitarian assistance, which again doesn't mean that human rights aren't relevant in a humanitarian assistance situation. We do work together, though, on non-discrimination issues and protection issues. So we've had various conversations over the years on you know, how we can adjust and relate to one another's realities, and how we can use each other's tools, and also how we can cooperate in practice. So yeah, basically that's it.
Thank you. Charlotte, anything to add on this?
No, I have nothing more to add on that.
Okay. If not, I have a new round of questions. The first one, I'm mixing several questions. It's about the alignment and lessons sharing between cooperation agencies. What could and should be done from your point of view, based on the recommendations from your survey? What could be the role of the European Union in terms of promoting more alignment, if you deem it useful? And how do you combine your human rights-based approach with the European Union's human rights-based approach when you develop joint programs or you collaborate? That's a first question. And then there is another question, broad question, about the difficulty to analyze impact of a human rights-based approach. So could you elaborate a little bit more on the difficulty to measure impact, notably because some rights could be conflicting, for instance? So what about measuring impact? That would be the second question. And the third question, one participant asked you to elaborate a little bit more on why the briefs on LGBT and disabled people were less used, as you mentioned during the presentation.
Right. Right. On the first one, I mean, yes, we of course need to align when it comes to lessons among agencies, and I mean, I think the issue at stake is to find good platforms where we can align. I think there's a need for it, and and I think we're interested in it. The role of the EU here. There is an established expert group within the EU on the human rights-based approach, Charlotte, you used to work for the EU, but that expert group has become more alive now and more active, and we meet regularly. But I mean, this goes beyond the EU. So what we need is, of course, other platforms and not just the EU. Maybe this working group that we're part of now could be one. So I think there's a need and a willingness to engage and get together and share lessons, but it's a matter of platforms, I think, and networks. So combining, I mean, the EU rights-based approach encompassing all human rights is very much alike our approach. There are no big differences, I would dare say. And in programming, it's difficult for me to. I haven't got the overview to say how successful colleagues have been in joint programming when our approaches meet, so to speak, and are supposed to be applied in practice. But I don't know, Charlotte, do you know anything about this? Have you heard anything about, because that's, Geoffrey, what you were interested in, right? How, when we work together, how that comes out in practice. Charlotte, have you heard anything about anything concrete when we work jointly?
No, I'm afraid I haven't. Now, it was some years ago I left the EU, but we of course have, when it comes to similarities, because as Birgitta said, the approaches or the rights-based approach encompassing all human rights that we have in the EU and our human rights-based approach are well aligned. I think the problem is both for SIDA, to be honest, and for the EU is to actually apply it. We have in the the EU joint programming guidelines, there is, or at least there was, now I don't know any longer, a specific chapter on how to work from the human rights-based approach, or how to plan programs from the human rights-based approach. So I think that in practice it shouldn't be a problem, because in theory we are well aligned, but I think the problem is that it might not be done in practice, and I think that is the major challenge, and that is also why the EU has had a quite impressive training initiative the last years, and they also, but of course you will discuss EU more in a later webinar, trying to combine gender and human rights-based approach analysis in a more concrete way, and also to try to avoid this fatigue of mainstreaming different tools and so on. So it's no, I don't think that I don't have any concrete examples of it, but I don't think it should be a challenge.
Yeah, when it comes to impact, I mean, the evaluators basically say that, you know, it is extremely difficult to see, to sort out what the impact is from having applied a human rights-based approach, especially when you do it, since you do it differently in different contexts, and you know, in complex change situations. Complex change situations where so many other processes and issues are impacting. So that's why they said that it basically wasn't you know, possible. The briefs.
I have something there.
Right.
No, because of course it also comes back to that we don't have, or we very rarely have, indicators, human rights-based approach indicators in results framework, and so we don't have a way of measuring impact on project or program level either, because we very rarely use indicators, and that is a challenge, and that is something that we have to work on, both SIDA, but also within the EU, but also with the World Bank and UN agencies and so on, to be able to measure it, because I don't think it shouldn't be that complicated. But if we don't have the indicators integrated, then of course we will not have the information.
No, that's true, and that's true also at project and program level, of course, and that's a challenge in itself. But then the impact level, if you talk about country level, I doubt that would solve this issue at program level, at country level, actually. Briefs, LGBTI and persons with disabilities. These briefs were developed for our staff at embassies to, as part of awareness raising for them to in their work to identify who the most discriminated people in a country could be. And we know that persons with disabilities and LGBTIQ persons you find in every country, and then you can have various groups that are more context specific, like indigenous peoples and different minorities. But this was a way of pushing them to take more informed decisions on who the discriminated groups in countries are. So they're more like information briefs on country level, and at that time it also had to do with the lack of information at country level on these groups compared to children. I mean, there's a whole battery of information also at country level for children and child rights compared to persons with disabilities. But as I said, they have not been used the way it was planned. So we think we need to change this.
And we have also found out that it's quite to have this material updated. It's quite if it should be updated with information from each country, it's a very complicated process, and of course it has to be updated every time that country goes to a specific human rights mechanism and comes back with new recommendations and so on. So it's quite challenging work to do.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have time for other questions, but all the questions will be shared with the presenters. There is no problem. Well, thank you very much. So from my perspective, this was already a very interesting way to actually share lessons from this survey. And with my colleagues from the PSR, Policy Supporting Research Group, on the European-based approach for Belgium cooperation, we will take a lot of interesting ideas from reading your survey. Absolutely, that's really interesting. So for all the participants, I can tell you that all the webinars will be organized soon. And if you signed up for the mailing list when registering to this webinar, you will be, of course, invited at the appropriate time. So, well, once again, thank you very much. And I wish you a very nice end of afternoon or early morning, depending from where you were participating to this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.